What's up, Tolkien Poppers? It is Nick here, bringing you another episode with a killer guest, Clare Moore. Yeah, Clare Moore, who is an amazing Tolkien scholar and focuses on feminism and disability studies within Tolkien Studies. And she's just an overall cool person. And we like to talk about, the fall of evangelicalism and like to dabble in some theological cynicism here and again. But here we're going to talk about her work in feminism and disability. And, just a little bit about her. She's a student at the University of Glasgow, researching disability in Tolkien's Legendarium, studying under the legendary Tolkien scholar Dimitri Fimi. Yeah, sick. She holds an MFA in creative writing, an MBA in politics, philosophy, and economics. Triple threat. Her research focuses on disability, gender, and race in the works of J.R.R. Tolkien. In her work has appeared in Malorn, Journal of Tolkien Research, and Mythlore. Her essay, A Song of Greater Power, Tolkien's Construction of Luthien Tenuviel, won the 2022 Tolkien Society Award for Best Article. Yeah, so it's serious. Clare is a serious guest, and she is seriously awesome. So, sit back, relax, and get ready to get your minds blown by this conversation. And talk to you guys soon. Peace. What's up, everybody? This is Nick, and I have another Tolkien Pop podcast episode with an amazing, cool person. Clare Moore is here with us, Tolkien scholar, just badass human being here, and she has agreed to hang out with me on the internet today. And I'm stoked to have you here, Clare. How are you?
I'm good. It's starting to feel like fall, so I'm appreciating the slightly cooler weather and look forward to the leaves changing and the death of all the insects.
Yes. Oh, the death of insects, the
I
wasps be
celebrate it
gone.
yearly.
Yeah, mosquitoes, wasps be gone.
Yeah,
Um, yeah, the South we experienced like a little cold front, but it's gonna be 90 on Friday, so I'm not really excited about
that's
it.
not very autumnal, so
Yeah, we'll see. We'll see how it goes. But yeah, before Claire and I hit record, we were just talking about how both of us are in the middle of the school year, and we take off time during the summer, and now we're in the midst of a routine. So the fall, the crisp weather, and just feeling like productive human beings, I guess.
right. Hopefully back to school, back to homework.
Yeah, yeah, rough times, but good times, but good times. But Claire, we've hung out on the internet and we've done conferences and done a lot of just interacting and engaging each other's work for, I want to say, probably like 3 or 4 years now, something like
I
that.
know. I was thinking it was more like shorter than that, but of course my time scale is all wrong. So I think it's actually been quite a while now.
Yeah, it might even been somewhere around 2020. Like
I think so.
it was pretty close to when Robin started the whole researching thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I've had a couple of Tolkien scholars on here, some kind of online people, but, we both get super nerdy in the academic way. And I wanted to hear specifically about your academic fields, which I think are, you correct me if I'm wrong, but it's feminist and disability studies,
Yep.
right? In theory.
Those are my two ponies.
Yeah. And, for me, before, I'm kind of putting the cart before the horse here, or the pony. But as far as somebody I think of as like the person who's like in the trenches, who is like almost like a front runner in these two fields, I mean, I think of you, and I don't, I think you would probably be like, oh no, maybe, but I think people know.
I'm
I think it's true. I think that's objectively true.
Thank
Um,
you.
so I want people to know your work and what you do. But before we do that, I wanted you to tell us about you, how you got connected to Tolkien, and I guess why you still engage with him and the Tolkien community and scholarship and all that.
Yeah, I do love that question. I feel like I have a couple different versions of it, depending on the audience and what I decide to give. So I'll give you a version I haven't actually told anyone yet because I feel like I'm going to make some assumptions about being a child of the 90s and growing up in an evangelical household, but I think I'm
Absolutely.
not too far off base there. So I was born in the 90s to Christian parents, and I grew up in California. Grew up sort of in the aftermath of the Jesus movement. And so very much sort of non-denominational evangelicalism. And for those people who were old enough to remember, the first Harry Potter book came out in the late 90s, 90, I want to say like 96 or 97, but I don't remember. And
I think
so
that's right.
my parents were definitely those Christians who did not want their kids reading those little satanic books. And so they were like, we shall distract our children with something else. And they had heard, of course, like at the end of the 90s was when they had announced that they were making the Lord of the Rings films, the Peter Jackson films. And so my parents were like, yes, we shall like latch onto this instead. And so my parents read to me and my brothers, they read The Hobbit out loud to us. And then I read The Lord of the Rings on my own. We had like the BBC radio adaptation too. And so we kind of did all that. And then Peter Jackson movies came out. And after that, Lord of the Rings just became my entire personality for the foreseeable future. And it did succeed in distracting me from Harry Potter. Like I did not read Harry Potter until I was in college, and honestly was so obsessed with Lord of the Rings. I had no time for anything else. I feel like it's a whole other conversation about how maybe teaching your children critical reading skills is more effective than censorship, but it definitely did work on me. And so then I was obsessed with Tolkien as a kid. It was, I think, different. And Nick, I'm not sure how much you would relate to this too, but like my like early like fandom and engagement was offline. So it was very much like with friends or family members who
Totally.
like Tolkien. So like my brothers and I would like dress up in the backyard and like hit each other with wooden sticks that we had made. And I would like write fanfic in like a notebook, but not post anything online because it was kind of before that and then during the advent of that. So it was very much just interpersonal. So it wasn't really, which is like, your friends and family anyway. So your existing networks. I didn't really get involved in the Tolkien community until 2020, really. During COVID, when I did in-person event programming, which during 2020 came to a halt pretty fast. And so I had a lot of time on my hands. And so I started dabbling in Tolkien research, sort of on a lark, and then unfortunately met Robin Reed, and she turned that into like a more professional pursuit. And kind of through her and Luke Shelton and some other people met you and a lot of other folks who lived all over the world, all over the United States, all over the world. And I feel like that was how I really got involved with like with the Tolkien community. So I feel like in addition to kind of always coming back to the books, the movies, which, I love despite their imperfections, I've just met sort of like the best, which I'm sure you can attest to too, like the best people that make it so much fun to talk Tolkien, so many years later, since the 90s and the 2000s, and to engage on it on so many different levels. But I think, yeah, the people have been great, and the people keep you coming back, and they make it pretty fun. So it's been a good community to be a part of.
Yeah. So, which like a lot of your story just resonates with me in a lot of different ways. Growing up evangelical myself, my family had converted when I was like kind of at 5. They were not Christians and then converted, so they didn't have the same stigma towards things like Harry Potter. But
Probably a good thing.
they were the outliers. We'd be at church, talking about seeing the movies, and parents were like, "You let your kids do what?" My parents were like, "Yeah, it's so cool. It's a like fun little book." And then evangelical people their minds were blown.
I mean, the funny thing is, and like, I won't send this podcast to my parents, but like, they only banned Harry Potter because like they had not read it. They had just heard about it in like the circles. And so they were like, don't read this. And I was like, okay. And then I just went to the school library and checked out like all of Tamora Pierce, which is like, why have just dark magic when you can have dark magic and maybe some adult content? Like, so it doesn't work. But yeah, Parents try, kids always find a way, I feel like.
Yeah, there's no, it's whatever you find in the library, in your uncle's cabinets, whatever it
Yeah,
is.
you'll
Yeah.
find something.
No, that's cool. I totally agree that like it was very interpersonal until I started getting involved with the Tolkien Society. And for me it was around 2016 and really seriously the same time 2020 because we all had
Yeah.
time on our hands and
We had
everyone was on the internet. Yeah. But like I say, people keep coming back. Um, and it's just a great place. It's just a good place to hang out with people. Like you said, I think we can share our experiences, and when you have that shared experience with people, and you're like, yes, someone finally gets me, you know.
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, cool. I appreciate you sharing that story. I think a lot of people who listen will appreciate that, especially from sort of a shared evangelical background, because I feel like a lot of people that we know who listen and other people that we don't know will be a part of that experience. Yeah, yeah. So I guess we've talked about and bring all these different areas of culture, you know, but just like everywhere else, the viewpoints from people on the margins of society tend to go ignored. And two particular perspectives you bring to the forefront of Tolkien scholarship that we mentioned earlier are those of the feminist and disabled. And so, you know, could you tell us a little bit about each perspective, why they're important, and how you came to bring them into your Tolkien scholarship, into your, you know, fandom, etc.?
Yeah, definitely. I definitely came to feminism first. And that was kind of, I mean, the Claire's journey to feminism was like 30 over, 30 some years in the making. But it was definitely kind of the one that I became aware of sooner. And so those people who are familiar with my work or have heard some of my talks know that I'm very like fairly big on definitions. And so I did write down, and I was like, don't forget this, Claire. When I'm like talking about feminism, I'll sort of use Bell Hooks's definition, which is feminism is a movement to end sexism, sexist exploitation, and oppression. And I love that because it's short, it's concise, it's to the point. But I feel like it also makes the point that feminism or like a feminist critical lens is not anything that's about women. And it's not about like being anti men or anything like that. It's more of kind of looking at dynamics and systems of power in society and personal levels and kind of analyzing those to see how gender determines some of these systems of power and some of these dynamics and looking for inequalities and how to right them. And so I feel like that's something that I kind of had to like learn coming out of conservative circles is that like feminism is not just about being like pro woman and anti men,
Right.
more about sort of just the overall goal of making a society that is fair and equal for you and how you experience the world, no matter your gender. But there are other definitions of feminism out there, but I find that one helpful because it's easy to remember.
Yeah, Bell
Um,
Hooks rules. She rules.
Yeah, I'm like slowly. I have actually not read everything that she's written. I have read a lot by her, but I'm like trying to slowly work my way through all of her books because they're so helpful because they um like are theoretical, but in a way that's understandable for regular people like me. But yeah, so she's good. I hope someday to kind of like apply more of her work to Tolkien. I feel like that would be a great project. But for me, feminism kind of intersects with Tolkien because from like the very first time I read Lord of the Rings in like fourth grade to now, Eowyn has always been my favorite character. I feel like for me, she really speaks to like the power and importance of representation. Like not only is she like normally depicted as like a white blonde woman, which I am, but more that she's growing up in a family in a world surrounded by men and kind of struggling because of her gender to really find her place in a life that can make her happy. She is just as capable as, the boys around her. And like for context, I have four brothers, so relatable. And then, she has her big moment in Return of the King where she kills the Witch King, which is like the most badass thing ever. And then I know there are like a lot of different takes on her ending to the story. But for me, it was always then that she gets to find peace and find happiness and a life that she gets to make for herself when she chooses to marry Faramir. So I think I was always invested in her story because of her struggles and then ultimately like her success in finding an ending that she wants. And so I had always paid particular attention to her story. And then when I finally, after like several unsuccessful tries, managed to make my way through the Silmarillion, which I did not do on a first attempt, it was a struggle. You can notice so many more of Tolkien's female characters, and they're so cool. Like they're so badass, and they have such great stories. And so I feel like for me, I really started with just paying attention to the female characters, but then kind of, more along the lines of what Bell Hooks is saying is like when you pay attention to those stories, the feminist angle is not just that it's about Luthien, but to start to see how gender dynamics affect her story. How does the patriarchy affect like her family dynamics with Thingol and how Celegorm and Curufin treat her and all these things. And so I feel like paying attention to the female characters was kind of a first step. And then when you reread these stories that you love over and over, you start to see a little bit more of the dynamics of how gender plays into it. And then I feel like once you start to think along those lines and see it, it can be hard to kind of unsee it afterwards. But that's my like that's feminist Claire's journey. That probably started when I was like 9, still ongoing now that I'm 33.
Love it, dude. Love it. Just want to reflect some stuff back to you just before we, give us some more context for the disabled aspect. But I think that the systems part of systems of oppression, or at least systems that make it harder for certain people of certain demographics to thrive, or at least be self-determining, is a big important aspect to focus on, especially too because I think of terms like whiteness too, where it's not just about skin color, right? It's about
it's a whole system.
And so for some of our listeners, who I'm sure there's people who are super nerds like us, and then some others, but could you like give us some context about like briefly who Luthien is? Because I feel like too, for those of you who don't know, Claire has showed a lot of people that Luthien is probably one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful character that Tolkien
I think the most
written.
powerful, but that's up for debate, but I think she's a strong contender.
Yeah,
I know. So Luthien, and I'm primarily like a first age person. So as much as I like love Eowyn, most of my research is about the first age and the female characters there. So Luthien is an elven princess, but she's half Maya, half special angelic being, and half elf. And she meets a man, Baron, who kind of like wanders in. They have their little romance in the forest. Her father is like, no, you can't get married. Very Shakespearean, very like fairy tale. Unless you complete this impossible task of going to get a Silmaril. So Baron sets off to do that, gets captured immediately. He is definitely the Ken in this Barbie story. And then Luthien runs away from home and rescues Baron, and they work together to get the Silmaril, and they become extra important in Tolkien's Legendarium because after Baron dies at the end of the story, Luthien goes to the Halls of Mandos and gets to choose between mortality and immortality, and chooses to become human instead of being an elf to be with Baron. I think Luthien's story is a great example of analyzing a story through a feminist lens, because Luthien herself individually is such a strong female character in almost like any way we would interpret the word strong. Like she has her own sense of agency and self-determination. Like her dad tries to lock her up at home. She escapes. She defeats Sauron to rescue Baron. She defeats Morgoth to steal the Silmaril. She's just kind of like, no man can stop her. No Maya can stop her either. No Vala can stop her. But at the same time, that story is such a good way to explore like the systems of power that can oppress and marginalize people. Because essentially, like, Luthien's going through this fantastic journey of fighting werewolves and evil bad guys, but she's also fighting so many patriarchal structures. Like Fingal is the worst. Fingal is a
The
very like
worst.
patriarchal, traditional, conservative man, as the father, the head of the household, and he tries to stop her from choosing who she's going to marry and kind of that self-determination. Caligorm and Curfin try to capture her and force her to marry one of them for like a political alliance. And so all the men are conspiring in such a way that I think really highlights the systemic nature of it, where it's just all over the place. And Luthien is successful in, um, you know, overcoming those systems for herself, but not successful in changing it for women who come after her. Not that she was trying, but Middle Earth remains pretty patriarchal, which is why Eowyn is also stuck at home. So anyway, Luthien and I could talk about her for 3 hours, so I'll try not to.
No, I love it. I love it. And I, just wanted to hyper on her just because I know you've done work with her. And I think that it is one of these like flagship examples of a woman character, like not just fighting, like you said, these fantastical evils, but
Mhm.
also this people that are supposedly on her side preventing her
Yeah.
from doing stuff. And for those who don't know, we won't get into the weeds, but her mom is also an angelic being, very
Yeah.
powerful, and also gets ignored and subverted by people who are supposed to be on her side. um, and so I just thought that was a great example. And you know like I said, the most of the women characters that are present in the legendarium and are fleshed out are in the Silmarillion, as you said. And the same with disabled characters as well. Like I feel
Yeah.
like the disabled characters that are numerous, and not only numerous but just like really prevalent and fleshed out, are also in the Silmarillion. So I guess
Yeah.
could you lead us into some of like your journey with disability studies, and then of course connecting it to your own in interest in characters in Middle Earth.
Yeah, that's interesting that you put it there because there's definitely more women and more disabled characters in the Silmarillion. So I'm like, did I choose the first stage or did the first stage choose me
Oh
based
shoot.
on my interests? But yeah, disability. Um, I came to disability much more recently. Um, I the very first conference I did, which was really only like the second thing I did in when I got into Tolkien studies. The first thing I did was write the paper on Luthien for Malorn, hence my love for her. And the second thing I did was I presented a paper at the Tolkien and Diversity seminar that the Tolkien Society hosted, and that was on disability. And that was like my first kind of foyer into that topic. And so I did a little bit of research, and there is some research out there about disability in the legendarium. But I do remember like distinctly talking to Robin, who's been a great mentor to me. So we talk all the time. I send all my questions her way. And I remember telling her, there's so much here that hasn't been written on. Like someone could totally do a PhD on this. And then like a couple years later, I was like, what if I did a PhD on this? But yeah, so that was kind of how I got into that topic. I was interested in disability studies and again, kind of like my experience growing up and identifying with Eowyn was that, oh God, I don't even know how many years it's been, but shortly after college, I was diagnosed with a chronic illness. Not serious. I'm fine. I'll live to be 100. But I have Crohn's disease, which just kind of is like well, it's an autoimmune disease, and I think some differences between disabilities and chronic illnesses, but there's also a lot of overlap. It's kind of like a Venn diagram. And so when I would read about disability theory and disabled experiences, a lot of it was like far beyond anything I ever experienced. But some of it was very relatable. So I was very interested in how that kind of played out in Tolkien's Legendarium. And I guess for like the sake of this discussion, and I'll try to keep it short because defining disability is also like my PhD. So you all can read that when it comes out.
Hell
But
yeah.
I think at least for the context of this conversation, we can just say that disability, for like a general definition, is like differences in the mind or body, or we might say like body mind is one word to think of them as integrated from like established norms and that affect someone's experience and how they live. Um, and so I was kind of taking that, decided to, for my PhD, take that topic. Was lucky enough to find some supervisors who wanted to supervise that project, Dimitra Fimi being one of them at the University of Glasgow. And so this is also the danger of having too much time on your hands because I was reading all the theory, all the disability theory for research and other projects as an independent scholar, and eventually just decided if I was going to do all of that reading, why not just throw a bunch of money at a university and they would give me at least a piece of paper for all that reading? So that's how you end up doing a PhD, everybody.
Absolutely. I freaking love that.
I got see 2020 just gave me way too much time on my hands, and now here we are.
Yeah, one day I'll jump on the PhD train because I'm also have a strong desire to throw university money at a university to give me a piece of paper for something
Right?
super nerdy.
I know. Well, I mean that was kind of my reasoning. It is a lot of money for a piece of paper, but it is worth it if you are so inclined, which um, I was. So now I'm about to start my third year of a PhD.
Yeah, yeah, that's sick, dude. One of the things that I heard you say, especially the mind body thing, and I'm kind of taking us off a different trail that I hadn't sent questions for, but I think especially the mind body kind of collaboration or I guess just the non dualist understanding of mind body, which we don't have to get too philosophical, but we both, talk theology and
Now.
philosophy, yeah, together, which is fun. But I feel like that is something that is missed in Tolkien himself, is that his own, I think, metaphysical understanding for his own personal real world beliefs, but I think even in Middle Earth, I think there's such a like almost like a evangelical, you know, postmodern understanding of Tolkien where they're like, oh, of course there's a soul and a body. And not to say that
Yeah.
Tolkien didn't believe that, but they aren't as separate. And I think the mind and
Yeah.
body aren't in Tolkien. Have you found that in your research?
Yeah, that's actually a really interesting topic. And to be honest, I'm one of those people where like I take an interest in philosophy and theology, but sometimes it just hurts my brain. I do feel like your assessment that people interpret Tolkien as this very kind of like Platonic, a la, Saint Augustine, a la Thomas Aquinas, a la
Right.
C.S. Lewis. Like there's a lot of work about the dualism in Tolkien, but I think when he's writing about the Hora and the Fea, apologies if I say that wrong, he talks about them separately, but he also talks about them like very in a very integrated fashion where I'm like, he can name the two things, but they're supposed to be like intertwined. And
Right.
I also think so I think in his conception when he's speaking of it, it's integrated, but I think even more so there's often I think in Tolkien because Tolkien writes, he writes his like fiction or like his prose and his poetry, and then he writes his philosophical essays about his world. And I feel like sometimes there's a disconnect in those two things where Tolkien might, when he talks about them conceptually, it might seem more dualistic, even though I still think he means it to be integrated. But when we look at the depictions of how the souls and bodies work in the Legendarium, they're much more integrated. Like it's a huge disaster conundrum when Muriel separates her like mind and body. And then even then we're like, well, how is she weaving in the halls of Mandos if her body is over in like unresolved things? And then in sort of like the character's lived experience, Turin's a great example. The mind and the body are very linked. Like one is definitely affecting the other. And so I feel like sometimes Tolkien will say one thing, but then when he's actually writing his stories, it might be a little different than he said it was.
Yeah, totally, totally. And he's just a person like all of us where we
Yeah.
say one thing or we're trying to make sense of something and when our lived experience doesn't really fit those categories we create. Yeah, so I guess those embodied experiences like similar to Luthien, like which characters without, revealing too much of your PhD research, but like what like disabled characters have you seen that you're like this is such a key aspect of understanding disability like in the legendarium, or at least one case of it.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, there's so many. I mean, I feel like my PhD is gonna be like 80% of characters from the Silmarillion and like 20% second and third age because there's just so many. I do think that the Children of Hurin is a very special story because like everyone is disabled except maybe Turin, but even then we could argue about that. So I think that's a story where you probably don't even like need my analysis
Hmm.
to think about that because there's so, especially when you read not the chapter in the Silmarillion but the standalone volume, which incorporates more of the material. But one of my favorite examples, because I'm such an apologist for this character, I'm probably the only one, is Morgoth. So I just love I love evil characters, and I have a soft spot for him because he's I don't know he wants so bad, and yet he can never quite manage it. Unlike Sauron, I feel like he's not quite as efficient or capable as Sauron. Um,
Agreed.
but but Morgoth tries so hard. But I think he's interesting because I feel like in a lot of ways he represents some of the sort of difficulties of interpreting disability in literature and a lot of the kind of like pitfalls that literature can fall into when depicting disabled characters. But then at the same time, I think there's a lot of opportunities in his character for kind of like imaginative interpretations of his disabilities, especially within the context of fantastic literature. So, and again, for the people who like, did not ever get through the Silmarillion, try not to think about the Silmarillion. Morgoth is one of the Valar, so one of the kind of, demiurgic, almost godlike beings. He's the baddie from the very beginning. He's out there with his like trombone while everyone's on the piano and nobody likes him. And so he very quickly is like established as the adversary. But I think it's interesting to think about him or any of the Vala because they're disembodied spirits, like thinking about this like body mind integration, and then they become embodied when they enter Arda, and then they have the ability to change their form, appear how they want to. Morgoth will lose that ability over time, which I'm sure we'll talk about. And then, so they like choose to become embodied, which I think is interesting context when you're thinking about, if you think about disability as a deviation from the norm, I feel like we have to think about, well, what are the norms for Vala, for the Valar, because that's what Morgoth will be deviating from. But he has a couple of big disabilities, like moments where he's disabled. When he touches the Silmarils after he steals them, they burn his hands, which is a very like painful experience. His hands go black. When he fights Fingolfin like stabs his left foot, and then Tolkien says that he went ever halt of one foot after that. So part of me is like he's either limping or on crutches or on a wheelchair. He probably would not use any kind of mobility device, even though he should. But he's very like noticeably disabled after that. And then during that same fight, when he tries to take Fingolfin's body to do bad things to it, an eagle mars his face as well. And so I kind of count all those three things as disabling. Some of them might be more disfiguring than disabling, but those two things are related in a lot of history. And then after that, Morgoth stops coming out as much. One, because, I don't know, he's embarrassed. He's going to send his cronies out to do it, but also because he's much less able to move around. And so I feel like all those disabilities are very symbolic. Like obviously like the burned hands, like he was stealing something with his hands that he shouldn't have been. His foot is injured, which makes him less of a warrior. He can't get around as much, and obviously like the eagle marring his face disfigures him and makes him uglier because he's already kind of been assuming just like a dark and terrible form, and he essentially becomes disfigured. So he's just being clearly marked as the bad guy. And I feel like this relates to the concept, like kind of like a proto-disability concept called physiognomy, which was big in the 18th and 19th centuries, but also before then, about how someone's exterior can reflect their interior, which gave rise to a lot of bad disability tropes that, disabled people are weak or stupid or evil or all these other things. Disability, especially in literature, becomes very much a marker for bad things, whether it's weakness or wickedness. Shakespeare's Richard III is a great example. I use that example all the time. Morgoth's a lot like that. But then at the same time, I feel like while other disabled characters in the first age, like Mithras is a good example because he gets his right hand cut off. And then Tolkien is like, but then he was better with his left hand than he was with his right. So he like is unaffected by his disability. But Morgoth clearly is. Like Morgoth's
Right.
disabilities have embodied realities for him in a way that no other character in the first age really does. And so in my opinion, I think he is one of the best representations of an embodied experience, kind of thinking of the mind and body intertwined. Because Tolkien also writes about the pain that he experiences and all these things that I think really tie the body and the mind together for him. And then he, over time, in losing his ability to take a fair form or to change form at all, loses some of his previous abilities that were special to him because he was one of the Valar. And so his kind of type, his existence, sort of in reference to his type of being, which obviously only exists in a fantasy world, changes. And so that's very interesting. So I feel like some things, I feel like Tolkien's probably drawing on some traditions that came before him that maybe had some bad tropes, but he's also, I think, setting the stage for some very interesting possibilities.
Yeah, no, it's you. I love the Morgoth example because, like you said, it's just he seems like a character that just holds multitudes, where it's
Yeah.
not where it is the exploration of like, oh, here are the negative tropes about evil characters being presented as disfigured or having a disability, but then also some of the, I guess, workarounds or the ways that he utilizes his power in light of
Mhm.
those problems, which are
Yeah,
creative
I mean,
and
he pours his power into like the very matter of Arda, which
yeah.
is almost like a super ability. And at that point, so he he finds ways to get around some of his restrictions due to his disabilities.
Yeah, oh, it's so rad. That's so cool. I love the Morgoth example just because, I feel like Morgoth, when you're bringing up the trombone, I just think about everyone playing in a symphony and, Morgoth being like the metalhead or the punk rocker,
I
you
know.
know?
I have this like headcanon where like all the other Vala and Eru are all these like French romanticists, like classical music. It's all the like Ravel and Debussy and like Claire de Lune and all these things. And then I will preface this by saying I'm a huge like my favorite composers are the Russian composers. And then it's like Morgoth over there, like Tchaikovsky with his canon, and like no one likes him. And it's just a difference in taste.
Yeah.
But they're like, you can't sit with us now, please stop. But
Russian composer, clearly evil. Clearly
clearly
evil.
evil, the Stravinsky of the Valar. But yeah, so I also with Morgoth, I always wonder, and I know you're familiar with Dawn Wall's Thuma, but her work about the historical bias in the Silmarillion, like so, especially when you think about something like disability, because I feel like for Morgoth's disabilities that seem so metaphorical and symbolic, I wonder how much of that, if we're thinking a little sort of meta, is like the text interpreting his disabilities for us, like which might be Tolkien interpreting it for us based on like his familiarity with traditions, or it might be the Elven narrators interpreting it for us, because obviously they would construct him as the bad guy, much
Right.
like the Tudors constructed Richard III as the bad guy. And so I don't know, some of it I'm sure is just how if we're going to think about the framing device that Tolkien intended, like how much of that does some of the interpretation for us when we think about Morgoth's disabilities, and is he just in Angband listening to his metal music and wishing he had a few friends? I don't know,
Yeah. Poor guy. Poor guy.
guy.
Uh, no, so rad. For everyone out there, if this is why, if you sound like that's so much, what are we talking about? But just like in a lot of other historical quote unquote texts, there are different voices for each like book almost. Well, I guess The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings are Hobbit voices, but then yeah, obviously the Silmarillion is elves, or at least elvish perspective through the Numenorians or something, right? Something
Yeah,
like that.
I have actually talked to Dawn a little bit about this. She has an essay about this because Tolkien's original construction of the narrators were elves, and he had like one of his late in life ideas that it would actually be human history. But then Dawn thinks, and I forget the name of the essay where she talks about this, that Tolkien never actually did any like retroactive editing to make it so. So
Hmm.
Tolkien said it was going to be a human history, like passed through the Numenorians, but the writings all kind of remain written from his when he was thinking of elven narrators and those elven narrators are biased. They're biased against my boy Morgoth, so I take it
Bias.
with a grain of salt.
Yeah, the unjustified hate of Morgoth. I love it.
Right.
I love it. Love it. Um, so like I guess a lot of the criticism that you engage with doesn't only focus on textual or conceptual applications as we're talking about, but practical real world applications as well. Like you're looking at it within the text, within the characters themselves, and how their experiences are embodied. Um, but like obviously that translates into the real world as well. So I guess with your particular focuses in mind, like why do you think this purview is important, and how do you think it stacks up against more abstract and intellectual criticism? Because we could sit here and talk about intellectual and character studies and metaphysics all day.
Yeah, I know. Is that a threat to your audience that we can talk about that all day? Well, I think it's the activism aspect, I think, is especially important for feminist and disability theory because both of those theoretical developments came out of political and social activism and then moved into academia, theoretical research spaces. I mean, obviously, feminism was has a long history, but born out of the different women's movements, the suffrage movement. Disability theory is much more recently. It was developed out of activism in the 80s and 90s. And so in a way it's important because it was activism first. And then kind of like you said, like it's one of those things where okay, I mean I love to do theoretical research and character analyses and studies and things like that. But at the end of the day, if we're only thinking about how this applies to people who aren't real, like that's interesting and fun. But when there are people who are marginalized and suffering and oppressed, obviously, like sitting here with our books is not really enough. And so I feel like it's important to do both. Like I definitely think that the theory and the research and all of that is important because it helps us practice and hone our skills to recognize these like power structures and dynamics and things like that. And if we can practice recognizing those things in fiction, then we can look around at the real world and see them there too. And I feel like that's an extra important skill in the rise of neo-fascism. But learning to identify those things in the real world is obviously valuable because then we can do something about it and thinking about it in fictional settings can help. And I always kind of think of, and this is like my like a little, my weird analogy, but for something like disability theory and feminist theory, to reference one of my favorite films, an American classic, National Treasure.
Oh yeah.
And I'll also preface by saying that this object is not historical. But in the movie, Benjamin Franklin has those glasses with the different colored lenses that you can like move up and down. And so if you think about a critical lens as like one color, like one colored glass, one specific lens, and you can take it on and off essentially. And so you could just look through one at a time. You can look at two at a time. We'd call that intersectional. And you can move them around, and they all help you see different things at different times, right? So when they're looking when they're looking at the map on the back of the Declaration of Independence, this is a very serious discussion. You can see something that you couldn't see otherwise by just using one lens. And then you can see something you wouldn't see otherwise if you use just another lens. And you see something completely new if you use both at the same time. And so for all the people who are afraid of critical theory, don't know what it means, think it's too woke, I feel like ultimately what it does is it just helps us see the world, see something in the world that we might have missed by honing in on that one thing. So if we look at gender dynamics in a book or in the world, like a situation in the real world, if we think in terms of gender, what does that help us see? And then if we think about a book or a situation in the real world through a focus on disability, what does that help us see? And maybe we can learn how to look at those together, but all of those different things will help us to see something else. And I also just feel like, again, if we're like tying it back to the opening about evangelicalism and their trends toward anti-wokeness and all these things, but I feel like as Christians especially, like we have like a spiritual imperative to be able to recognize who is marginalized, who is oppressed. Like the Bible is constantly telling us to help these people, but you can't help them if you don't know who they are. or if you're in deep denial about who they are. And so I feel like these theoretical lenses and just the practice of using them, it just helps us recognize like who in the real world needs help. And then we can start to think about like how we can help them. So I feel like that's very grand told through my silly metaphor. I am by no means like a great activist. I feel like I'm very much still learning how to incorporate all of this. But as I sense in the year of our Lord 2025, activism is going to be an important part of our lives. I think it can help, and they both have a place. Just a matter of learning how to use both of them together.
Oh, yeah. I love everything that you said. Just thanks for giving us some insight into all these different aspects of the theory and Tolkien, and even within like an evangelical or Christian faith context, really. But I just think about how even the idea of seeing, like, well, not even the idea, the act of seeing is perceived as like this abstract theoretical thing where people are like, oh, intersectionality, critical theory. It's all this, you know, woo woo stuff that's for the
Yeah.
academy. But it really is like seeing with those lenses. And your national treasure is great because it breaks it down in a fun way. But it's an embodied act first,
It
right?
is.
It's an embodied act first, and then people make sense of it through the language.
Mhm.
And I think, like you said, you got to kind of explore it first and read, because I think you kind of alluded to this, that like you can feel passion and anger towards something you know nothing about, right? And then you
Yeah.
jump in, and then people are like, slow down, who are you? And you could cause more
Yeah.
harm than good. But like you said, if you sit on your ass all the time reading books, then that's not good either. um Man, I just love the embodied experience, and I can just kind of tie it into just other parts where with Christianity in particular, where it's like even the foundations of our faith, and like the life of Jesus was a life first, and then it
Yeah.
was, theorized and
Yeah. And
theologized and stuff.
I mean, and the imperative that like faith without works is dead in some way it really speaks to me. I'm like, well, theory without activism is dead. Like if I can be a little sacrilegious and change some of that language. But yeah, I mean, the what's the right word? Like the importance in disability theory and feminist theory or like gender theory is like the root of both of those things are embodied experiences. Like, how do you experience the world as, that identity, as someone who's disabled or abled, as someone who's, female, male, non-binary, like that affects our embodied experiences. And then the activism is born out of that. And it should also like help us connect and build relationships with other people who also need our help in making a more equal world and making a safe world for everybody. So yeah, I like thinking about it as kind of an embodied like it's just an embodied life from the very beginning.
Hell yeah. Hell yeah. So I guess for fans and scholars of Tolkien who want to learn from and uplift like these voices, right? Women, disabled, queer folks, that sort of thing. Where would you point people to get acquainted with feminist and disabled theory and theorists in general, and then maybe within Tolkien studies and fandom specifically?
Yeah, well, for general feminism, so the quote when I defined feminism earlier, that's from Bell Hooks's book, Feminism is for Everybody. It's a great place to start for feminism and Bell Hooks just in general. It's not too long, it's very accessible. Even shorter is Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's "We Should All Be Feminists." It's super short. It's basically like an essay published as a book, and I feel like for general theory, those are great to start because they're also kind of like for a popular general audience. In Tolkien studies, the kind of like foundational work on for feminist Tolkien studies is Perilous and Fair, which is edited by Janet Brennan-Croft and Leslie A. Donovan. And so that's kind of the starting point for anybody. And then if I can plug an upcoming work,
Yes.
Cami Aiken and I are editing a new book on women and gender in Tolkien studies that we hopefully will be out in 2026 or 2027. We are in early stages of working on the chapters for that, but it'll be an anthology. Lots of great scholars have chapters in it. And then as far as just kind of like scholars in general, for people who just kind of want to search around and find some work to read, Cami Egan, Zara Brown, Robin Reed, who we've mentioned, all do a lot of work explicitly using feminist lenses. So they're kind of the good places to start. If you find something by them, it's probably from a feminist perspective. For disability, let's see. Well, anything by Alice Wong is kind of a good general place to start. She's a disabled activist, and she's written a lot of different things. You can find essays and books. I feel like that'll kind of head you off in the right direction. For disability in Tolkien Studies, I did put together annotated bibliography when I first started working on my PhD, because I was like, look who just collected all the stuff on disability in Tolkien. I should probably publicize this so other people know where to find it. It is hosted on Robin's Substack because I don't actually have a website. It probably desperately needs to be updated, but it's at least a good starting point for anything I could find that is related to disability in Tolkien studies. So I forget, I think Writing from Athelion is Robin's Substack. So it's on there. You now can navigate the tabs. But that working bibliography will list a bunch of essays and book chapters that you can check out.
Man, so rad. Yeah. Just for listeners out there, if you look up Clare's stuff, a lot of Clare's essays are open access online. And so she footnotes a lot of people as well. And so if you hear people like Sarah Brown or Cami Egan or Robin Reed, obviously listen to the podcast, you've heard about you've heard Robin herself. But like I said, if listeners, if you're out there and you want to get connected to this work, reach out, get you connected to everybody, because everything that all these people that Clare have mentioned, including Clare herself, do fantastic work. But yeah, I mean, Clare, this has been a lot of fun. I appreciate you doing this, but I guess before we go, tell us a little more about like where can we find your work, anything that you're doing, anything you want to promote. You already brought up the, obviously in the future, the new volume, but what else have you got down the pipeline?
Oh my gosh, the PhD, which I need to start focusing on. Well, if you want to find me, I'm not on a ton of social media these days, but you can find me on Blue Sky. It's just Clare L. Moore. I go there to avoid working on my PhD, so you can always chat on there. I am trying to finish the PhD. I'm hopefully about halfway through, and that is like all on kind of all my thoughts on disability and Tolkien. So in years from now, when that's finally finished and shared, that will be a good place to start. I have a couple of chapters in books that are hopefully coming out in a year or two. Obviously, I mentioned the anthology that I'm editing with Cami Egan. I also have a chapter in Robin. I need to stay away from Robin. She just involves people in projects. I have a chapter in Robin's Reed's anthology about race in Tolkien's work coming out next year after. And then Luke Shelton and Demetra Feeney are editing an Oxford handbook on Tolkien. And so I have a chapter in there about the medical humanities, which includes disability, but also trauma studies, aging studies, motherhood and reproduction, and some other things. But that will also essentially function as a working bibliography. So if you are interested in those topics, you can go to that chapter and see all the sources that are currently out there and decide what you want to write to add something new. So I feel like that'll all be years and years from now, but PhDs are long-term commitments. So I gotta see that one through.
Yeah. Maybe, if this thing keeps going, maybe we'll, talk some more over the years as far as, just us personally, but then even maybe on the podcast. And then when you're Clare Moore PhD, we'll get you on here to,
right. When the PhD is finally done. Well, I'll be talking about disability for at least a couple more years. So we have time.
Well, cool, dude. Thanks for doing this. Yeah, I'll look forward to just hanging out again soon. Yeah,
it's been fun. I know. We'll run into each other and discuss all kinds of fun things like the rise of Christian nationalism and the fascist state and Tolkien, as friends do.
Oh yeah, all the positive things. Yeah.
Yeah.